So let's begin in prayer. Lord God, we thank you for all the far-ranging things that we can discuss as we travel together through the history of our world, understanding how that history impacts upon us today as well. We ask that you'll bless us as we continue our journey today in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so we stopped last time at what year?
146 BC.
Ah, see, Barry, look at those notes, eh? They really make a difference, don't they? Absolutely.
Well, sorry, that's the beginning of last lecture.
Okay, 146. 146 is where we stopped, and that was the end of the
Carthage.
Carthage. That's it, Carthage. So the end of what we call the Punic Wars. Okay, the end of the Punic Wars, and this is the time when essentially they've destroyed Carthage and have become the masters of the Western Mediterranean. Okay, so essentially at this point, by 146, you can call Rome true empire. Okay, it is an empire. It now controls the Western Roman Empire. Oh, the Western Mediterranean. So from Spain all the way through to Greece. Okay, and to the south, but not Gaul. Okay, so not what we would call France today, but rather that the Mediterranean, the coastal fringe. Okay, remember coastal? Why coastal? Why would they focus on the coastal? Trade. Remember, I've told you about trade all along. Is that trade is the lifeblood of the world. Okay, everything's about trade. The reason why we go to war is really about resources, which is really about trade. Okay, so trading is where the process is all about. And so what we end up with is in 146 is that the whole coastal fringe of the Western Mediterranean is controlled by Rome. Okay, this is also essentially the end or the beginning of the end of what we would call the Roman Republic. Okay, that already by this stage we could see that it's getting a little unwieldy. It's getting a bit bigger now. It's getting a little more complicated to pull this all together. I mean, you now got the people in Spain. We've got the North Africans. We've got having to deal with Sicily and Corsica and Sardinia and Italy itself, and everything is getting a little big, a little complicated. Okay. Remember also that during the Punic Wars, one of the things that began to develop was a standing army. Okay, a standing army. Okay, because remember they needed a standing army. They couldn't just use reserves. They couldn't just use guys who were fighting part-time when they were fighting against an enemy like the Carthaginians. Okay, and they realized that particularly because of Hannibal. Okay, remember when Hannibal came in the Second Punic War and ravaged Italy for 11 years. The issue with that is that they looked at this and said, we don't have anything that can stand against that. We can't fight against it. And remember that there were repeated raids from the Gauls. Okay, the Gauls repeatedly attacked the northern part of Italy. And so what they realized is, hang on a second, what we need is a standing army. Okay, we need professional soldiers. Now, how do you get professional soldiers?
Pay them well.
Pay them? Well, I like that. I like the way you say that you pay them well. There's a story that sometimes they got paid in
Time.
Salt. Running the worms.
salt.
Salt is very...
Well, salt was very, very important, and it wasn't easily got hold of. Okay, I mean, you would think that it should be quite easy. Just get some salt water and let it evaporate. But it actually takes a while to do that. You need a whole lot of water. So there were industries around salt making. So salt was actually a very valuable component because of what it can do. I mean, it can, preserve, it can enhance, it can do all those things. So salt was quite good. But of course, the Latin for salt is Sol. Sol. And that's where we get the word?
Salary. I see. Oh dear.
So your salary is your Reward in
Good point.
insult.
Yeah, not worth your salt as the
Well, that's right. You're not worth your payment. Exactly. Well, this is where it all comes from. Okay, is the concept of salt, salary.
You're
Okay,
sounding like Siri.
I'm like Siri. No, she's female. I'm not. I don't. No, the male version.
Ask her why a fire engine's red, and she goes through all this.
All the history and tells you. Yes, that's right. Well, look, I'm glad I can be the human version of that. Yes, but yes, salaries comes from that. So the soldiers were getting that. But what was the big thing that would make you want to become a soldier?
The reward at the end.
Yes, which was
Well, you become a citizen.
Become a citizen.
citizenship. That's it. That's the reward. So I mean, to become, and of course, to get someone to become a soldier, that was quite a big deal because they had to sign up for 25 years. Now that's quite something. 25 years they had to sign up for. So 25 years, so 20 years in active service and 5 years in the reserves. So even after you had actually been in active service, they could still call you up as an emergency legion or legionnaire. But remember that you would be joining the legions when you were about 14 or 15. Okay? So it means that by the time you retired, you were still able to potentially have a family. Which still made it worth your while. Okay? So you could still go and have your piece of land, and you could still have a bit of a life before you croaked. Of course, the good thing with it, though, is that the big problem was that there's a good chance you were going to die on on service as well. But well, that was the chance that you took. Okay, but you can see how that would be in this period of history when you weren't given citizenship, when citizenship had to be earned or inherited. That it gave people a sense of, okay, I'm prepared to try and do that.
And they valued it.
They very much, oh look, citizenship, we don't value citizenship the way we used to. Okay, I think that's very much a thing of I mean, as somebody who's come to another country and become a citizen of another country, I take it very seriously because I made the choice to become a citizen here. I mean, one of the things, of course, for me was a case of was I going to become a citizen or was I going to become a dual citizen? But of course, I wanted to be prime minister, so you can't be no, that's not true. But actually, it was true. But I mean, but then but nobody voted for me, so I couldn't get it. The thing with it is that I had to make that choice. I had to renounce my South African citizenship in order to take up my Australian citizenship. And so there was a real sense of that. But remember, for Romans, it changed their entire life to be a citizen because they were treated differently. Remember that Peter, for example, when he was crucified in Rome, when he was martyred in Rome, was crucified. Remember that story? And also the story is that he wasn't just crucified, but he was crucified upside down. Okay, because he didn't want to be crucified like the Lord. Where do we get that story from, by the way? Because it's not in the Bible. Not the Gospel of Thomas. It's actually the Gospel of Peter. Yeah, it's actually called the Gospel of Peter and Paul. Okay, it's what they call a lost gospel. Okay, but we find out about that gospel in the writings of one of the church fathers, who then quotes from that gospel. And that's where we get told about the fact that, about the concept of Peter being upside down.
Would you die quicker upside down?
Slower.
Slower? Because the blood would...
Well, the thing is that you die in crucifixion by asphyxiation.
Yes.
But if you're upside down, that's not going to work quite the same way.
Doesn't sound nice either way.
No, look, I think that was the whole point. I think look, we're going to be talking about that next time when we talk about the peculiarities of Rome. But no, there was nothing very pleasant about the Roman system of punishment at all, and on purpose. Crucifixion was developed on purpose.
It looks so awful.
Well, it was even more awful than that, because remember, the dying part was only part of the story. They used to leave the corpses on the crosses indefinitely. indefinitely. Well, and remember above Jesus' head they put King of the Jews?
Yeah.
Well, that was the general thing for crucifixion, is they always put the crime on a placard above the person's head, so that anybody walking past could see what they did, and therefore don't do it. Okay? It was a word of warning, absolutely. I mean, one of the things particularly with slaves. Okay, so runaway slaves, they would crucify them and put runaway slave on the board, so that every other slave, which would be 1 in 3 people walking past, would say, I better not run away, because that's what happens. And as I said, they would leave them on the cross until the body fell apart. So it was a gruesome, I mean, we need to not have any, kind of idealistic rose-colored glasses about the Roman Empire. It was a very brutal empire. Amazing in its technology, amazing in its advancement, amazing in its size and complexity, but some of that was held together by a very brutal, violent perspective. Okay?
Were there dual citizens in Rome? I mean, could you be a citizen somewhere else and then later be a citizen of Rome?
No. Because most other nations didn't have the concept of citizenship. Because remember, they were ethnic. So,
what about the other empires?
well, remember that the Babylonians may have used the Jews, for example, like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, but they never became Babylonians.
No, but I wondered if others who wanted to be assimilated into Christ could take out.
I would almost want to say that citizenship is something fairly unique to Rome.
No.
It's something which, that emphasis on being a citizen is something which is very much a Roman.
Not even Greek?
See, the Greeks weren't looking for citizenship. They were actually looking for cultural assimilation. They didn't want you to be a citizen. They wanted you to be Greek. So for them, their citizenship was a lot more, a lot deeper than an adherence to a vision. It was very much a change of person into a Greek. So I think that citizenship was very much a Roman kind of thing.
Kiwis, Romanicist.
Yes, that's it. I am a Roman. Yeah. Okay. So we get that? 146. This is what's happening in Rome. Now, in 146, what's happening on the other side, in the Middle East?
Probably wars.
Yep. I think you're probably correct. Now, it's happened a little bit before this. Around about the 150s. Maccabees. Okay, this is where I stopped last week, was the Maccabees. So the Maccabees now starts under a guy called Judas. Okay, Judas, and his real name is Judas the Hasmonean. Okay, you say that's the H is a you just clear the throat. Okay, Judas the Hasmonean. Okay, Hasmonean means the pious. Okay, the pious one. And Judas is a Hasmonean. And what happens, remember what happened after Alexander died? So when Alexander died, he controlled an empire from Greece to the Indus River in India, right? Just the threshold of India, all the way through to Egypt, and then obviously, the European section as well. So you got the Greek peninsula, you've got Asia Minor, and then you've got the Middle East area all the way through to the Indus. All of that was the Greek Empire. But of course, he dies, and what happens?
It gets split up.
It gets split up, and it gets split up between his council, his generals, okay, the people who had been following him. And the two that particularly are important in the eastern part of Europe at this point are a guy called Ptolemy and another one called Seleucus. Okay? Ptolemy is given control of Egypt. Okay? Egypt and the Holy Land essentially becomes part of Ptolemy. Seleucus gets given the kind of, I suppose today, what we would call the area Syria. Okay? What later becomes the Roman province of Syria becomes the domain of Seleucus. Okay? But Seleucus, of course, isn't happy with his bit, and so immediately goes to war. Yeah, well, yeah, that's what happens. Okay? So they go to war. He goes to war with Ptolemy. They fight with each other. And in fact, this happens in all the parts of the Greek Empire. The various, these guys who took over, and they're called the Diadochi. Sorry, I need to spell that correctly.
Do you read up on this the night before you arrive?
Of course I do. I just read it all and then I come and say it. And, now look, I do read some things before, so that I just refresh my mind. But some of these I read a little while ago.
But we're not quite sure that's spelled correctly unless we check.
Well, you could check if you like. You could actually, if you want to. So the Diadochi, they're kind of the top guys in this area, and they start fighting with each other. So what we call at this point is the wars of the Diadochi. Okay, who come and they fight with each other and re-establish their boundaries. And what happens is that Seleucus actually defeats Ptolemy, and so takes over the Holy Land. And so Ptolemy is now only got Egypt, okay, and holds on to Egypt all the way through until the Romans relieve him of it. Okay, well, not him, but his successors of it. Okay, whereas Seleucus then takes over that area around Syria, and it takes over the Holy Land. Okay, and then, as I said, there's others of the Diadochi who take over the other parts of the old Greek Empire, including the Greek homeland itself. Okay, is part of that. Now, what we see here is that it's this guy here, Seleucus, who continues the legacy of Alexander. Remember, Alexander's point was not cultural absorption, but cultural assimilation. That's what they were trying to do. They were trying to make the people into Greeks. Okay? To follow Greek culture, to follow Greek language, to follow Greek religion. Okay? All of those things, to follow Greek activities. So wherever they went, for example, they will build baths, they will build stadia, they would build theaters, temples, absolutely, temples, in all those places, so that they would convert the population from whatever they are into becoming Greeks. And remember I said that one of the big vehicles of that was the language. Okay, and the language is the language of Greek, but not the language of Aristotle and Plato and those boys, but a language or a version of Greek that was accessible to people who would have Greek as their second language. Okay? And that was, as I said to you before, it's called Koine Greek. Koine means common Greek. Okay? Sometimes people refer to it pejoratively as kitchen Greek. Okay? So it's the kind of Greek that you would use if it's not your first language. Okay, so it's not the classical Greek of Plato and Aristotle. It's a common version of Greek. And now, the importance of this cannot be understated, particularly for Christianity. Okay, because Christianity was founded through the writings of the New Testament. Okay, particularly into the Roman Empire. But the reason why it was able to do so quickly, I mean, in the space of 300 years, Christianity goes from being a little, cultic little religion of a bunch of little Jews to being the religion of the Roman Empire. In 300 years. That's phenomenal speed. And one of the reasons why that speed was possible was because of Greek. that the Bible was written in Koine. And so therefore it became accessible to everybody. You need to also remember that every Roman was taught that the Greek culture was great. So even though the Romans spoke Latin as their first language, all the educated Romans would also speak Greek.
So would that be common Greek, or would they have
Classical Greek. Classical Greek for most of them, because they would be the ones who would follow Aristotle and Plato and so on. Yeah. But they valued Greek culture in the same way that the Assyrians before had valued the Babylonian culture. Okay? They thought that that culture was worthy of preservation. And so that's what the Romans did. So the Romans, and this was long before the Romans took over the Greek peninsula, right? Before the Romans took over the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Eastern Mediterranean. Even before then, they valued the Greeks. Okay? Now, that's not hard to understand, because remember that the southern part of Italy, so the southern part of the Italian peninsula, was actually controlled by the Greeks. Remember? We talked about that before. It was called Magna Graecia. So it was actually already there. They had already had influence and connection with the Greeks. Okay? And we see that, for example, in things like weaponry and so on. Is a lot of the early Roman weaponry were actually modeled off the Greeks. Okay? So there's a connection between that. You could see that they valued a lot of what they did. Okay? And so this concept of what Alexander did, and then what was moved on by his successors and continued by his successors, is what created the fertile ground from within which Christianity could grow when the Bible came out.
Did it influence the Jews?
It did.
The Jewish.
Absolutely influenced the Jews. Because remember, the Jews translated the Tanakh from Hebrew into Greek. So absolutely it affected the Jews as well. But you see, the Jews were interesting. The Jews were, I'm trying to think what you could call them. You could call them cultural chameleons. Oh, that's a nice one. I've just invented that one. It works well. They could change their spots on the outside depending on where they were. In the inside, they were still chameleon. On the outside, to anybody looking at them, they looked wherever they were. So even though they were in Egypt, to the outside, they looked like they could speak Greek, they could connect with it, they could sell things, they could be bankers, they could do all those things to the locals. But on the inside, they were still Jewish. I mean, it's one of the reasons why the Jews were always beaten up, was because they never assimilated. They never assimilated. They only ever showed the outside. They gave lip service to the local culture, but then they went home and did their own thing. Okay.
So were there complaints when it was translated from the Hebrew to the Greek? I'm saying, the Greek translation's not the true translation.
Not in this period of history, but later on, yes. So after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the Jews revert back to the Hebrew versions for everything. And I think they begin to associate the Greek with the Romans, with the destruction, with the overlord. And so what you see now, for example, is that the Septuagint is basically non-existent within Jewish culture. Everything has to be done in Hebrew. And so at that point, the Jews changed from being chameleons to becoming isolationist. And that's a big change that happens. And it's that isolationism that get them into trouble in Europe during the Middle Ages and later. Yeah. Okay. And we'll talk about that as in our next series. But okay, so do you see this? So Seleucus then wants everybody to become Greeks. Okay, he wants everybody to become Greeks. Now, you can change the language, but to change the language still doesn't change the heart. The place where your allegiance lies is in your heart. Okay. Now I know I'm pointing to my pumping system here, but we know that we're talking symbolically. The issue is that your heart doesn't change. So what lives in your heart? Well, hopefully, you're looking at you to say blood.
Will governs what you think.
Yeah. So what lives in your heart? I'm a little worried. I'm talking to a Christian group here, aren't I? Yeah, no, we're not talking literally. No, we're still talking metaphorically. Look, if you were atheist, I could understand that. There might be something else. It might just be blood or something. But it's at the heart, at the core of your being is your belief and your relationship with God, or whatever you replace God with. Okay, so of course for the Greeks and the Romans, that would be the pantheon of gods. So that would be Zeus or whatever it is. If you were a farmer, you would have the god of the land. You'd have maybe the god of the sun and the god of rain. Maybe you'd have some of the other gods that you would work with. But essentially, at the core of your being is faith, is spirituality. Okay, that's what it was forever, and it's always been that way. Okay, I mean, this concept of atheism is really a fairly new affectation for us. And even atheists, I don't believe, are atheists. What they've done is they've just reformed God into another image. Okay, for some, maybe they've changed a spiritual God into science, and science has become the God. But there's a sense of the design of us that we can imagine something that is beyond us. That's part of the reality of humanity. We've got ability to have what we call reflexive consciousness. We are conscious of the fact that we are conscious. And to be reflectively conscious means that we can assume and understand something that is beyond us. And that's the concept that we've called God, in whatever form that may be. So what did Seleucus realize was that if you're going to change people, if you're truly going to assimilate them, you have to change their understanding of God. That means that he had to beat out of the Jews their belief in Yahweh, and had to replace the belief in Yahweh with the belief in Zeus. Okay, in Zeus and the rest of the pantheon. Okay, so he had to transform their religious perspective in order to change their heart, to actually make them truly Greek. To get someone to speak Greek doesn't make them Greek. Okay, you have to actually make them believe in the point of that. And so what he wanted to do was to transform their religion. And this is where then he makes a decision. And so this is now a few generations down the road. It's a guy called Antiochus. Antiochus the Fourth. A lot of these guys had nicknames. His name was... What was his nickname? Remember? He was the guy with the big head. Maybe both literally and figuratively. I'm not sure about the literally, but...
Who would have thought?
Epiphanies. An epiphany means... Well, that's what we think of it as an insight, but it's more than an insight.
Meeting with God.
A meeting with God. An epiphany is where God has come close to us. So what he was essentially saying was that he was God. He was Antiochus, God.
Why didn't the Greeks or whatever the powers develop a scheme whereby you could believe in any of the gods, and yes, Zeus and all that would be included, but let the Jews have their God, and then
because that's not cultural assimilation.
Well, it is assimilating because
Oh, no.
it's
Well, you see,
assimilating-
well, it depends on which level you want to assimilate. You see, so if you're Persian, then that's fine, because the Persians didn't want everybody to become Persian. What they wanted to do was to be happy under the Persian overlordship. So yes, so you're going to change their minds, but you're not going to change their hearts. The Greeks didn't feel that way. The Greeks wanted to change not only your mind, but your heart as well. And so they couldn't allow you to have your own gods. You needed to follow the gods of the state. And that way you then became fully Greek. And that's what Antiochus tried to do. And what he did was, he did it against the Jews. And this is the one time particularly when the Jews have said, that's the line. Remember, they've lived under the domination of the Assyrians, of the Babylonians, of the Persians, and of Alexander. They've lived under all of those. But Antiochus crosses the line. And he crosses the line when?
He puts an effigy in the temple.
No, that was bad, but that wasn't the worst thing. There we go. He sacrifices a pig on the altar in the temple. And at that point, the altar would become unclean. No longer could the temple be used for sacrifice. Okay? You can imagine what a big deal that is. I mean, it's like, for example, the government saying to us that that's it. You're not allowed to be a minister anymore, and we're going to confiscate every Bible. Now, that's happened in the past in other places. Okay? But that would be the same kind of thing. I mean, you would be saying to the Jews, that's it. You cannot, the focal point of your religious experience is now out of bounds. Okay? And yes, he did put statues of the gods in the temple precinct as well. Okay? And because he was trying to get the people he was essentially remaking the temple into one of the temples, into a temple of the Greek gods. Okay? Now, in the book of Daniel, there's a reference to that event. Or at least we think that's the reference to that event in the way in which we interpret it. It's called the abomination that causes desolation. The abomination that causes desolation. Okay? And that's what that sense of it. And so now you can imagine that the people, all that they need is somebody to rise up against that. Okay? Somebody to say, that's too far, you have gone too far now. And what that person's name is as I said, Judas Hasmonean, or Judas the pious. Okay? And he rises up and begins a new form of warfare. A form which is used to great effect since then. Now, I think it was used before that, but he actually won a war doing it. And that's quite something. It's called?
Guerrilla warfare.
Guerrilla warfare. Okay? Guerrilla warfare. Okay? And of course, this isn't the big hairy ape, but rather the other kind of gorilla. But yes, a guerrilla warfare where, of course, the Israelites were completely unmatched in the field by the Greeks. The Greeks would be able to annihilate them in a full-blown war. Okay, so in a battle of army versus army. So what did Judas do? Judas developed guerrilla warfare, where he would take a small band of guerrillas, and they would come in, they would attack a garrison, kill everybody, and then disappear. And essentially, he would attack as hard as a hammer. It would be like a hammer blow. And so that's where he gets his nickname, which is, of course, Judas Maccabeus. Judas the hammer. Okay, Judas the hammer. Okay, so he comes in, attacks, and then pulls back again. And of course, as his attacks became better known, as he kept on, winning these battles against Antiochus, he got more and more people beginning to follow him. Okay, now you need to realize that Antiochus was now fighting battles on at least 3 different fronts. Okay, so he was fighting this little civil war in the Holy Land, but he was also fighting on the edges of his empire, on the other side, on the eastern side. Plus he was fighting still with the Diadoche on the other side in terms of Asia Minor, and he still had to protect himself against Ptolemy as well, who kind of saw this as potentially an opportunity. So what you need to realize is that Antiochus was being drawn in lots of different directions at the same time. And what he realized was that I need to deal with these Maccabees either decisively or else I'm going to be in trouble. But of course he couldn't deal with them decisively because that's not how they were fighting. They weren't fighting in nice big ranks where you could just go in and you could defeat them and say, okay, all done, we can now go away. They kept on. Essentially it was the battle of 1,000 cuts. Okay, and so in the end, Antiochus realized that this is just too much hassle. Okay, well, Judas got killed, and his son took over, and his son got killed, and his other son took over, and that son got killed, and another son took over. So it's good that he had lots of sons. That's obviously helpful if you're going to be a leader of a civil war. But by the time he got to that third son, his name was Simon. Antiochus realized that in fact to deal with the Holy Land, which was really such a small and somewhat insignificant part of his particular kingdom, it was better to cut them off. Okay? Cut your losses, let them have their independence. Okay? And that's exactly what happened. And so for the first time since 586, since the destruction by the Babylonians, the Judeans have a free homeland. Okay? They, for the first time, are able to run their own affairs again. Okay? Now if you want to read about that story, if you want to read about how that happened, then you can read one of the apocryphal books. Okay? One of the books that were written in that period. It's called Maccabees, funny enough. Okay, 1 and 2 Maccabees gives you the story of what happened during the Maccabean period. Okay.
Can you spell Judas's name for us? That's a bit of a story. M-A?
Yeah, sorry, that's a M-A-C, so Macca, so 2 C's, and then B-E-U-S, Maccabeus.
Yeah.
Judith Maccabeus. Okay? And so Simon becomes the first, not king, because they didn't have a king, but actually took over the high priesthood as well. Okay, and so what we actually get here is not a kingdom, but a theocracy. A theocracy. So that is a country ruled by God. Okay, it's the rule of God. And so, of course, the top person would be a cleric. In the world today, what's the most well-known theocracy? Iran. Okay, Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini. Okay, he began that whole process of changing Iran from a kingdom with a Shah to an Ayatollah. Okay, to a theocracy. Okay, and so essentially, Judah becomes a theocratic state, a state run by the priests. Okay, and that lasts for
10 years.
100 years, from about 160 through to about 60. So for about 100 years, the Maccabees have control of Israel. Okay. And as you say, they live happily. No, they don't. No, they don't. Okay. The thing with it is that what begins to happen, of course, is factions happen between the various groups, even within the Maccabean state. Okay. There's factions that develop. There's one wonderful story about this one guy who wanted to become the high priest, but another guy was the high priest at the time. And so you know what he did?
Knocked him off.
Well, that would have been easy, but that you would kill them. You don't want to kill them because the Bible doesn't tell you you shall not mutilate. It just says you shall not kill. So therefore,
You introduce a woman into the plot. Politics.
on one side I got the pro and then I've got the con. So yeah.
He blinds him.
No, he actually bites his nose off.
That's right.
Oh dear.
Yes.
He bites his nose off. And of course the high priest can't have a mutilation. So therefore, he can't be the high priest anymore without a nose.
And they had no plastic surgery.
Well, no, they didn't have. I think they had metal surgery, but no such thing as plastic.
What sort of area did Simon take over?
It was roughly the area from Galilee through to Judah. So kind of basically that same area that we would today think of as Israel. Yeah. So not with the extension in terms of the eastern bank of the Jordan, but everything of the west of the Jordan, that area, including Samaria, and that area would all have been under Simon's control. Yeah. Okay. And so they're able to essentially carve out a space for themselves in the declining Greek empire. Now, remember, this is very important, that the only time that the little empires, that the little nations get a look in the sun is when the big empires begin to fade. Okay, remember we saw that before with when during the Bronze Age collapse, that was the opportunity for the kingdom of Israel to actually develop under David and Solomon. But it was once the big empires developed, then the little empires get sucked up again. And of course, the first time they can get a bit of space was because the Greeks were on the decline. Okay? And they were fighting so many battles and so many fronts that they couldn't hold their empires together. And of course, this is the point where the Romans come in as beginning to push into the eastern part of the Mediterranean. Okay? And they see the opportunity to push into what was the Greek area. And so we see the Greek conquests. So during this period is the Romans begin to take over the Greek mainland. Okay? Now, I love the way they did that. And they did it by kind of saying, we're coming to bring you freedom. Isn't that a good one? You know, they look at the Greeks and they say, you are under oppression with your leaders. They're poor leaders, they're weak, they're not capable. You are essentially like prisoners in your own country. You know what we should do? We should come and save you.
Sounds like the Crusades.
Oh, well, look, it was a bit like the Crusades, but except a bit more complicated. But nonetheless, and so what happens is of course, the Romans begin to take over that part of the Eastern Mediterranean. But I think that there's a much more sinister reason. Okay, first of all, trade. Because remember now, Rome controls Western Mediterranean. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the stuff that's being imported into the Western Mediterranean comes from the East. Okay, so a lot of things like silk and those kinds of things are coming through the land routes to China, through to India. All those exotic things and spices and all those kind of things are coming from there, and the Romans actually don't make any money off it. It's all controlled by the country and by the Greek Empire, which is still controlling all those areas. So the simple thing is to
Save them.
Save them. Save them from themselves. So I think that in fact trade is one of the big ones. The other one I think is that once you've got a standing army, what do you do with them?
Yeah.
What's the point of having a standing army if you've got
Nowhere to find.
no one to fight? I mean, it's the same thing that happened in the late 1930s. I mean, the Second World War was inevitable. Hitler had used the war machine to revitalize Germany, right? I mean, it was the development of this war machine that actually gave people jobs. I mean, remember that Hitler actually moved Germany from having an unemployment rate of 60% to the 1930s having an unemployment rate of 0.
60%.
Oh yeah, and that's conservative. Okay, to 0. Now how can you give everybody a job, and particularly a lot of them, he gave them a job in the army. So now you've got this big standing army, what are you going to do with them?
How are you going to pay for it?
There we go. How are you going to pay for them? I mean, this was in the period before fiscal easing. I love the concept of fiscal easing. Have you heard of fiscal easing?
No.
That's when the Americans decided to print money. $4 trillion of it. $4 trillion. They just printed the money. Not got any backing. They just said, oh, look, let's make $4 trillion.
It'd be nice if our printers could do the same.
Well, firstly, it would be nice to have one at home, isn't it? But, you know, it's the problem with plastic.
Doesn't it all devalue?
Sorry?
Doesn't it all devalue then?
Well, it should, but it didn't.
How come?
Well, because everybody knew that America would come back. And so they were banking on the fact that this would just be a little blip and effectively it will come back. So in fact, people didn't devalue the dollar. They did for a bit, but it didn't value that much. I mean, remember at one point we were, above one Australian dollar to an American dollar.
That's right. Yeah.
But look at where it is now. And it just shows, you see, the money isn't worth anything other than what people believe it's worth.
That's true.
I mean, it used to be worth something. It used to be actually worth gold. But then, of course, we all left the gold standard, and so our money's not worth anything except what I'm prepared to give it valued for. So it's such a wonderful, it's the ultimate fairy tale or pie in the sky system, our economic system at the moment. It is the ultimate pie in the sky. It doesn't really exist. It exists only in people's perception of its existence.
It's better than
It's very scary.
Bitcoin.
Sorry?
Better than Bitcoin.
Oh, but Bitcoin is the ultimate expression of that thing. Bitcoin actually has no value other than the value that the people ascribe to it. And of course it's scarcity value as well, because they're not making any more Bitcoins.
Sounds very
There's only a certain number of Bitcoins in total. And so that's why it makes it more valuable, because of that. But anyway, that's moving us into something else. So now, when you look at this, what's happening in terms of the Greeks is that the Greek Empire is beginning to fail. The Romans say, we will come and save you. We will come and save you. And so they take over the Greek mainland, and they push from the Greek mainland into Asia Minor. Okay? So now they're going into Asia Minor. And so now they see that the Jews are there as well. Okay?
Period, what date is this now?
So this is round about the 2nd century. Okay, 2nd century, they're starting to push this. Okay, so you can see that they're pushing east into Greece, and to a large degree, the takeover of Greece is done in such a way as to almost annex it. They kind of say, don't fight us because you're going to lose, so you may as well just give in, capitulate, and that's what happens. So in a very quick order, the Western empires of the Greek Empire fall to the Romans. And so now the Romans are knocking on the door of the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt. And stuck in between is the Jews. And so the Jews now are having a bit of a fallout with each other. And so you have a larger faction who's in control, and you have a smaller faction who wants to be in control. So what do you do if you're the smaller faction?
poison the others.
You seek
Yes?
help from some allies.
That's what you do. You go and find yourself a big brother.
Yeah.
And the big brother in the environment is Rome.
Rome.
And so you say to Rome, would you help us in this fight? And the Romans say, of course we'll help you. Of course. And they do. And in fact, not only do they help them, but they take over. And essentially Israel, or what at that point is called Judea, gets taken over by the Romans and becomes a client state of the Romans. Okay? And that happens in around about 63 BC. Okay? So in 63 BC, we've got Pompey and Julius Caesar and Crassus doing their thing, and essentially Judea becomes a province of Rome. Okay? Becomes a province of Rome.
Is that what they called Aelia Capitolina or something like that?
Well, no, that's later on. That's later on. That's when they renamed Jerusalem. That's the Roman name for Jerusalem in 135 AD, when it becomes the province of Palestina. Okay, so 63 BC essentially it's taken over by them, and that's they then controlling that space as well. And what that gives them, it gives them the foothold in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so now, essentially, the Romans control most of the Eastern Mediterranean. Now that's a big deal, because now they will, almost except for Egypt, they're controlling all the trade that's happening in the whole of the Mediterranean. Okay. And it's at this point now where we have the change from the Republic to the beginnings of empire. And that's under a guy called Julius, which in fact is not his name, of course. His real name was remember, that's his surname, okay? Because he's from the patrician family called Julii. Caesar just means king. So what was his real name? Gaius. He's Gaius Julius Caesar. Gaius Julius Caesar. Okay? So he's Gaius of the family Julii. Okay? So that tells you that he is a patrician. Okay? And he decides that he's not going to go east, he's going to go north. It's going to go north. And deal finally with those pesky Gauls. That's it. How many of you are Asterix followers? Anybody read Asterix? I love Asterix. I love Asterix. It was written by two guys called Goscinny and Uderzo. And when I was actually in London last year, I went to an exhibition of Uderzo, all his things, and it was really fantastic to see what they had created and so on. But of course, the story of Asterix was all based around this one village of Gaul that would refuse to give in to the Romans. Of course, there was no village like that, with a magic potion or elsewhere. The truth is that what Caesar was able to do was he was able to draw out the Gauls in full-blown battle, and he was able to defeat them. Okay, the main chief, or the chief that had combined all the tribal groups of the Gauls together, was a guy called
What's the initial? What's it?
V.
Oh, yes.
Vercingetorix. Yeah. So I mean, Asterix is quite good because, of course, in Asterix everybody ends with an X, which is quite funny because, of course, in Gaul they were the tribal chief who combined all the Gaulish tribes together to fight against Caesar was Vercingetorix. And he was able to he's tried to stand up against the Romans, but was defeated. Okay, he was defeated. We'll talk a little bit more about that because there's quite interesting stories about old Vercingetorix. But what happened with Caesar is that he had now won that battle, and so he came back with the victorious legions back to Rome. Back to Rome. Now there was a rule. There was a rule about this, and the rule was
They used to have above the Rubicon. But
That's right. You were not allowed to bring legions into Old Rome. Okay? And Old Rome was surrounded by two rivers, and you couldn't bring your legion across those rivers. And the northern river is called the Rubicon. The Rubicon. Okay? I actually saw the Rubicon, so that's quite nice to be able to think of that. But what Caesar did was that he came with his legions, and he crossed with his legions the Rubicon and into Rome, and declared himself no. You see, he never actually declared himself a dictator. He declared himself the first citizen.
The first citizen.
I like that. Isn't that so wonderfully euphemistic? I mean, essentially he's saying I'm the dictator, but he's saying if I call myself a dictator, then these people who've lived under republic for all their lives will reject me. So therefore I can't call myself a dictator. I'm going to call myself the first citizen.
Sounds very humble.
Ah, yes. I don't think Caesar was very much that. But nonetheless, the thing with it is that at that point what he begins to do is to undermine the power of the Senate. Now, it's in this period that we then get these little initials. SPQR. Have you seen those? If any of you have been to Rome, you'll actually see it on kind of things like their drain covers and so on. They say SPQR. Today it kind of just stands for the Council of Rome. But it actually stands for, it's in Latin, Senatus Popularisque Romanus. It means the Senate and the people of Rome. Okay, it's kind of the motto of the Republic. Okay, so that the Republic would be run by the Senate and the people of Rome. Okay? Now, if any of you want to find out more about this period, I want to recommend this. It's by Mary Beard, and it's called SPQR, so Senatus Popularisque Romanus. Okay? A history of ancient Rome. I think she writes really well. It's written in a narrative form rather than just a historical form. So she tells the stories of what happened, and there's lots of pictures and diagrams and things in it. And it follows from the beginning of the Roman Empire all the way through until the end of the Roman or the Western Roman Empire in 476. So
she's got a series on the History Channel.
She does.
Going now.
Yes. So she's actually leading it, is she?
Yeah, that's
Well,
one.
Well, there we go. So if any of you have got, so if any of you are got access to Foxtel or the History Channel in some other form, she's doing her thing now. But I think it's really written. It's very accessibly written, and I bought this one from the bookshop in the city, Kinokuniya, the Japanese bookshop. Do you know that one? Oh, gee, to not know that is like not knowing the Opera House. I mean, it's another cultural artifact of Sydney. It's without question the best bookshop in Sydney. There's no question about that.
Japanese.
It's Japanese. I wouldn't hold that against them at all. But it's called Kinokuniya. It's in the galleries, the galleries, which is just opposite the Woolworths near Town Hall.
Railway station.
Yeah, opposite Town Hall railway station. Upstairs, that's right. It's like a thing on the second level. But it's
Victoria Road.
That's right. It's on George Street. It's on George Street, yeah. But it's absolutely amazing bookshop. If you've not been there, go in and have a look at it. If you like bookshops. If you don't like bookshops, then go to the galleries or something. But I mean, if you, as far as bookshops are concerned, I don't know of any better bookshop in terms of just the breadth of stuff that it has. It is.
Second-hand books too?
They don't do second-hand, no.
Can you get it on video?
Well, I think this series, I suspect you could, yes. And if you're wanting to go for the audio book, I suspect it might be it might be an audio version as well for it too. I find audiobooks tricky myself because I kind of drift off with audiobooks sometimes. But video is potentially there. But certainly these videos that Ken's talking about most probably are available too. I'm not sure what this series title is. Do you know?
Or just Rome.
Just called Rome? Okay, Rome by Mary Beard then.
I think
Martin,
it's
you'll
one
have to learn to
one
pitch
to 10.
because you can listen to audio and eat at the same time. That keeps you awake.
Yes. I'm not sure that I'm going to necessarily learn to knit in order to do that. But thank you for that idea though. It is useful.
Picture Martin.
You can't picture it? No, nor can Martin. Anyway, the thing, what you need to see is that Julius Caesar heralds the beginning of the end for the Republic. But also you need to realize that the Republic is a very poor way of controlling an empire. Okay? Remember that the Republic worked in a number of titles where people would have an election, but there would be an election every year. Okay? Because remember who was running the show in the Senate? Were two guys called consuls. Okay? There were two consuls. And later on, once the plebeians took over, what you ended up with was one consul who was a patrician and one consul who was a plebeian. Okay? Now, two consuls, but they were elected every year. Now, why would you elect your leader so often?
Sounds like
Too drastic.
the dance, doesn't
You
it?
didn't want him to do too much damage.
Well, either do too much damage or take too much power. Okay? And that's also why you elected two of them. But that meant that the only way, and look, it's the same thing for us, okay? In the federal government, we elect a prime minister every 3 years. Well, now you see, I was checking to see if you were.
No.
Yeah, I was checking, and only one person said, no, we don't do that. Yeah, we don't elect the prime minister.
No,
Okay? In the Westminster system, you elect your local member, your local representative. And it just happens to be that if that local person is part of the party that has the most seats, then the leader of that party becomes the prime minister. Now,
temporarily.
well, it has certainly been our case. But remember that this is not new for us as Australia, right? We have replaced prime ministers before very quickly. In fact, I think in the first 10 years, we had 6 prime ministers of the Federation. So, so we've done this before. So let's not get, it's only the media that gets their whole, thing in a knot in order to deal with that. So we don't elect our leader, but they did. Okay? They did. They elected their leader, and they elected him every year.
Could they be re-elected?
Often not. What often they did is that there was a senior consul and a junior consul, and often the junior became the senior, maybe at the second one, but they only could serve maybe 2 years, and then that was it. You kind of did your stint as the consul. Okay? But underneath the consul were a number of other positions. And many people wanted to go for those positions because it was kind of almost like you had to go through the whole process before you could become consul. So you couldn't become consul out of the blue. You became consul because you had already served as some of these other things. So for example, there was a quaestor. I think there's an A there. A quaestor. Okay, and then there was an aedile. And then there were others as well. And each of these had different roles. Some of them have like roles of being like Supreme Court judges, is what we would call them today. And so you had to go through some of these other levels before you could be elected as a consul. But now, you can imagine that the only way that a consul could work, in the same way that the only way that our system can work, whereby we actually can change our government every 3 years, is if you have a... What do you need? If you're going to change your government every 3 years or every year,
You have to have the public service.
that's what you need. You need to have a good public service. You need to have people who are going to be there for a lot longer. Now, these positions were positions of people on the Senate. And so even when you step down from this position, you still continue to serve on the Senate. So what that meant was that was the continuity. The continuity was the Senate, but the leadership was what kept on changing. But you can imagine, once you start taking over more and more countries, once you start expanding the empire, it becomes more complicated for any leader to have a control over that. I mean, remember that to travel from Rome to the other side of the Mediterranean would take you months. I mean, if you go on let's say you're going on a campaign to go and take over the Seleucid Empire, that would take you 6 months just to get to it. Let alone the number of years that it would take you to actually do the campaign, and then it will take you another 6 months to get back to Rome. By that stage, you've already had 4 or 5 different consuls.
And it takes 6 months for the votes to get back.
That's right. So you'll be voting for the next election. Yeah, but look, I was one of those. They didn't have absentee votes. If you weren't there to vote, your vote wasn't counted. They also didn't have preferential voting either.
In Rome. Did you even
You vote in Rome. Oh no, always in Rome. That's where the Senate was. The Senate was in Rome. So that's where the voting took place. But can you understand how the republic system in an empire as big as Rome became more and more unmanageable? You needed somebody at the top, somebody at the helm who could direct the process, who could actually have the vision over generation rather than just a couple of years. Okay? So again, what we're seeing today in our society with China. China is one of the few countries, because of their system, can think ahead 50 years. Because as far as they're concerned, their system of government will be in place for perpetuity. Because their system of government is not based on an individual, it's based on the system. Okay? But of course they have one person who gets to the top of that system. The same thing happens to Rome. Is that what Julius Caesar looks at and says that if we're going to maintain our expansive empire, so from Gaul and Spain all the way through to Israel, then what do we need? Well, we need the army, but we need somebody who's going to control the whole thing. And that's when he begins to take the powers of the Senate and give it to the consul. So that instead of being elected every year, they now become elected in perpetuity. And of course the Senate said, that's a great idea. We should do that. No, they didn't. Because in 43 BC, what did they do? They killed him. Sorry,
Well, I thought it was 44. But maybe
well, it could be 44. Yeah, 44. Yeah. On which day? So that's which day? So it's exactly 1 month's time. The 15th of March. The 15th of March, 44 BC, they decide that Caesar is getting too big for his own boots. Okay? And in many ways, what they really were saying was that they were feeling that they were becoming empowered. Okay, that as Caesar was taking more power to himself, that the Senate was going to become irrelevant to that process. Okay, and so they kill him. But funny enough, they don't kill him quietly, like poison him or something. They kill him publicly.
He
On
was
the
he wasn't one of the consuls ever.
Yes. He was the consul at the time. He was at the time, yeah. Yeah. Okay. And so they kill him. And I mean, I'm not sure we actually know exactly how many stab wounds he got, but it looked like a lot of them took him out. And of course, what we mainly know about this comes from Shakespeare. You know, well, that's it. Et tu, Brute, yeah, you know, and you too, Brutus. I mean, the thing with it is, of course, is that that's Shakespeare's wonderful license. Where did we get the story of Julius Caesar from? It was actually written.
Shakespeare.
Well, no. Shakespeare used this guy. His name was Eusebius, but he was writing almost 600 years later.
600 years later.
Yep. So the story of Julius Caesar, we actually only know from a long, long time afterwards. That story of what happened. So again, how much of that is?
I was going to say, how good were his facts?
How much of that was real and how much of it was Eusebius making stuff up is another question as well. Okay.
Did they write stuff down much?
Yeah. Oh no, there were historians. There was historians in this period. In fact, there was one of the great historians of this period, and in fact, he was a Jewish historian.
Josephus.
It's not of this period, it's later on. I mean, Josephus is in 60 AD, so 100 years later. But still, I mean, he's writing about some of the stuff that happens in terms of that. Josephus, his real name was? His Jewish name was Joseph ben Matthias. So Joseph, the son of Matthias. Okay, was his actual name, and he gets renamed Josephus because he becomes essentially the writer in residence to the Claudian kings, to Tiberius. Not Tiberius, that's later. It would have been Nero and those guys, those boys here. In fact, Vespasian. It was actually Vespasian that he becomes the writer in residence to. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about that later on. But so you see that Josephus becomes the one of those historians. But there's another guy called Suetonius. There's Pliny. So all of these guys are writing at the same time. But the real biography of Julius Caesar is written much later. Okay.
There was also Cato and Julius Caesar wrote some of these.
Yeah, some of these things were written down. I mean, look, the biggest writer of this period, okay, whose writings we actually have is a guy called?
Claudius.
No, he's also only known because of the works of Richard Harris. Cicero. Okay, Cicero it was a prolific speaker and writer. He also became a consul, and as a consul, he was what they call a novo homo,
So he was after Julius Caesar.
which means a new man. He was a new man, which meant that he wasn't a patrician. He was a plebeian. Okay, and so he was one who had built himself up from being just a plebeian, so middle class, to actually taking over the highest title of the land. But this was before Julius Caesar took over. Yes, before Julius Caesar took over.
Not after.
Yeah. Now, he didn't take part in the assassination of Julius Caesar, but he did speak against the guys after that. Because after this, 3 guys kind of rose up to be kind of the leaders of the place. Okay, a guy called Mark Antony.
Oh, yes.
Another one, which I can never remember his name, I think it's Lysanias. And then a guy called Octavius. Octavius.
While there's life, there's hope. He was
Now-
the guy that did While There's Life.
Sorry?
He was the guy that wrote the quote, While there's life, there's hope.
Oh, is it?
Is he?
Octavian?
No, Cis.
Cicero. Oh yes, that could be. That yes, Cicero is fantastic. And again, if you get hold of anything about him, that's fantastic. Richard Harris, the guy who wrote the I Call It Claudius, I think, he wrote also a book on Cicero, which is excellent. Excellent series. I think it's a 3-volume series on Cicero's life as well. Really good. Giving you a background to his connection. And he wrote everything down. He always used to have a secretary follow him around everywhere, and anything that he said, they wrote it down. So that's quite an amazing amount of writing we've got from Cicero.
Having a secretary following is coming back. The doctors are going to have scribes.
Oh,
Yes, that's the new thing.
oh, is it?
To save them wasting time writing out details of the patient, some hospitals are having scribes.
Oh well.
You do have Karen doing that, don't you?
Yeah. Well, I just think it's good because it means we'll all get the right medication.
Every now and then.
Because I mean, when you look at what doctors, I mean, what we always used to make a joke about that, about doctors' handwriting, didn't we? So maybe this way will be a good way to get everybody to get the right medication. I'm not sure. But Octavian was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. Okay, and so he adopts Octavian, and he becomes part of the Julii kind of family. And so what we got is him and Mark Antony and this other guy, who then become the triumvirate and try and rule together. But of course, immediately they fall out with each other. That's it. And they start fighting with each other. And in the end, Octavian is able to defeat both him and Mark Antony. Okay, Mark Antony at the time had taken over what Julius Caesar had seized, because remember, Julius Caesar had expanded south as well into Egypt and had taken Egypt. That's it. That's when he had his little relationship. With it is nicely put, isn't it? Because of course he was married at the time, back in Rome. But when in Egypt, do what? No. Anyway, the thing with it is of course he has an affair with Cleopatra, and they have a son. And his son is named. Tells you something about Cleopatra when you think of the naming. She names him
Ptolemy.
Caesarion. As in to become king. So if he was ever called king, he would be King Caesarion. But of course, so Cleopatra falls for Julius Caesar, and then essentially cedes Egypt to the Roman Empire and becomes part of the Roman Empire. Now this is very important because in fact, Egypt, and we were talking about this earlier, is kind of the breadbasket of Europe. It actually produces huge amounts of grain, which in the end actually feeds Rome. And it's quite amazing when you think about it. When you think today that so many of those North African places aren't able to support themselves in a food level, and yet at those times they were the ones supporting Europe.
Warming.
Well, it is part of that actually, because there's no doubt that the Nile doesn't flood its banks the way it used to, and we're seeing the encroachment of the Sahara more and more every year. It actually moves a few meters closer to the coast. So there is some of that's part of that. But Octavian beats Mark Antony, who has actually also now aligned himself with Cleopatra. She is the ultimate survivor in a lot of this stuff. And of course, you know that she actually killed off two of her brothers, who she was actually married to as well, because that's how they did their thing in those days. She actually has them killed off so that she becomes the only queen of Egypt. So she wasn't, lacking in moral fiber. Anyway, the issue with it is that Mark Antony is defeated, and Octavian becomes the sole ruler of Rome.
Now,
Okay.
as he's adopted, Did that mean that they could adopt someone? What was he?
Yes.
Was he just a...
Well, he was kind of from another branch of the family.
Oh, so he was a patrician?
He was from a patrician family, yes.
Oh, he was?
Yes. But he was adopted into the Julii. That's right. Yeah.
Perhaps a slave could be adopted.
Not really.
Okay,
Could be freed and become a
It had
freeman.
to be something
But
like-
generally they didn't mix the groups, didn't mix all that much.
I just wondered.
No.
Because a slave might have been a king in another country, so it would be...
Yeah, but that didn't really matter. If it was another country, it wasn't Rome, and that didn't matter then. Okay, so what we need to stop. So what we have is we actually get Octavian becomes the king, and then calls himself, or he becomes known as... Yes, it's emperor, but his name is...
Augustus.
And he then is the first one to truly become what we would call an emperor. Okay? So the leader of an empire. Okay? But funnily enough, he too doesn't call himself a emperor.
Oh.
He calls himself the first citizen.
Yes, I-
Okay? And he maintains the Senate. The Senate continues to exist under his reign, but essentially he takes all the decisions. He makes all the decisions. And he becomes the king, well, the emperor, but you need to realize that he stays the emperor for 40 years. Which means that what he does kind of solidifies the empire. It actually sets a lot of things in motion. He's able to stop all the civil wars that are happening inside the Roman Empire, and so inaugurates what we call the Pax Romana, the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. The Roman peace.
And the Masada episode squashed
The civil war there, that's later.
oh,
That's later. So that's in 70 AD. So that's under Titus rather than under Augustus. Yep. Okay.
The slave wars.
The slave wars were in 73.
Oh, before.
Are you talking about Spartacus?
Yeah.
Yeah, 73 BC. Yeah. Okay. We kind of skipped over that, but in 73 BC was one of the big slave uprisings under a person called Spartacus. And some of you may have seen the movie. I still think it's a good movie. With what was his name?
Spartacus at the
Charlton
Colosseum.
Heston.
That's very funny. Spartacus.
Heston.
No, not it wasn't Charlton Heston. No, it was Kirk Douglas. It was Kirk Douglas, and I can see his face, but I can't remember his name. Maybe you can tell us next week. But yes, the story of Spartacus. So this gladiator who then raises up the other gladiators to then escape, and they then escape into the thing, and they draw together a slave army. And of course, the slave army was of course destroyed by the legions, and they were all captured. Well, a number of them were captured, and what they did was they crucified them down the Appian Way. So every 50 meters down the Appian Way was another cross of all these slaves. Just to remind all the other slaves, in the end, Rome will do this to you. So that was the slave revolt in 73 BC. Okay, so the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Now remember that Augustus straddles the birth of Christ. Okay, so Augustus is alive when Jesus is born, but not when Jesus actually begins to minister. Okay, so the ministry of Jesus is actually in the time of Tiberius. Okay, so we've got Augustus, then we've got Tiberius, and then we've got I'm not sure. So Tiberius, not Claudius yet. There's one in between. He's a bit of a nutcase. No, that's a later nutcase. There's a few nutcases in the thing.
What's it start with?
C. Well, his nickname is C. His real name is the same as Julius Caesar. It's Gaius. But his nickname is Caligula.
Had a scene video. I think we all watched a video.
It was all of
Yeah, you may have, yeah. So you got Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero.
very cruel.
Okay? And then, of course, after Nero, everything goes a little bit haywire, and they end up with 3 different guys in the same year. And then it goes to Vespasian. And Vespasian is followed by Titus.
Who did you say was the first citizen of Rome? Was it Julius Caesar?
Well, Julius Caesar also took the same title as Julius Caesar. So
Augustus used the same.
that's right. He used the same one. He didn't call himself imperator. He didn't call himself the king, the emperor. He called himself a first citizen. It's only later on that we really get the Roman Empire without the Senate, and that's actually in the 4th century where you end up with the Roman emperors saying, "We the emperor, and we don't need the Senate anymore." And of course, that's when things start going wrong for the Roman Empire. So maybe it tells you something as well, that when the top guy gets rid of all these flunkies, that's when things go wrong as well. Okay? Okay, so that gets us up to the birth of Christ. Now, what we'll do next week is I want to look at some of the characteristics of the Roman Empire. Some of the things about the Roman Empire that still impinge upon us today, and that certainly impinged on Christianity in different ways. And so we'll talk about some of those and the way in which they connect with that.